All right, welcome everybody to another August edition of Garden Hour. I say another, like this isn't the first week of August, but it's the first week of August. August has snuck up on me. My name is Amanda Bachmann. I'm the SDSU Extension Urban Entomology Field Specialist based here in Pierre, and I am joined tonight by Dr. Maddi Shires and Dr. John Ball, who are both going to share some information with us. Um, John, what are you going to be talking about tonight besides
Well,
trees? I mean, we know trees.
trees, bugs, and anything else that comes to mind other than politics. But we're going to start out with answering the questions we left our audience with last time. So,
Awesome. I am maybe ready. And Maddie, I feel like it's been a while since we've lined up on Garden Hour. So what's going on in the plant disease world?
Yeah, so tonight I'm going to cover some of the things that we're seeing come into the clinic and some of the diseases that we think might be a problem over the next month or so with the current weather conditions we continue to have.
Awesome. And for those of you joining us at home, you can always put your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can keep an eye on the chat. Sometimes we'll throw some links or resources in there. And if you can't figure out the Q&A, you can throw a question in the chat as well, and we will field those sort of at the end of each one of our segments. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with Dr. Ball.
all right, thanks. Let's see here. All right, as our viewers know, I always kick it off with a little bit on growing degree days. As I mentioned in the last episode, it gets a little less important now. In the spring and in the summer, it's really a driver for a lot of plant activities. Still is. We actually have some insects. One of the ash borers, clearwing ash borers, that really will be still is yet to come, believe it or not. But for the most part, they're done. However, we're still about 200 degree days behind last year. And I know, as people mentioned last time, it's been so hot. Yeah, it has. But once it gets above 86, that additional temperature does not count. So we're still paying for the relatively cool spring and early summer. And then last night was fairly cool in Brookings. It was 52 when I got up to let the dog out this morning. So it kind of had that little bit of chill in the air. Should mention too that we are getting fruit beginning to harvest. These are our summer crisp pears. Picture I took this last week when I was in Mobridge. Summer crisp pears, I don't like them. They have a nice red color once they fully ripen. They're as hard as a rock, and they're crunchy, but not juicy. And a little on the sour side to me. But this is a good example of why pears and apples were actually in the same genus 100 years ago. There is very little difference between them. And this is a pear that kind of tastes like an apple. Not a juicy apple, but an apple nevertheless. So some people like it. Has less problems with fire blight. It's one of our Asian pears. A little bit more grit to it. It's not like the butter pears that you enjoy. Those you get from the store typically, but it's a pear that lives here and again follows the John Ball theory of fruit. The crappier the fruit, the more likely it is to grow here. All right, and this one fits. But remember, Amanda, we left off with the dragonfly
Yes, the
apocalypse.
dragonflies.
Look at these actual size. And this was a swarm, and I'll let you explain the swarm here, Amanda, why we have this picture of a beach in Rhode Island. I'm sure Peter Griffin is here somewhere along with the family,
Oh,
but
yeah. So, and these were the blue-green darners, which are some of our big dragonflies. So when you see like the big ones around your backyard, like that's these guys. You can also see, yeah, there's just so many, and they kind of came in off the ocean. So like the theory was that they had kind of like clustered up because other sort of like water sources were starting to dry out, and they just kind of massed up and got like blown onto this beach. Dragonflies are predators, so they usually don't hang out in large groups. Like they're not super buddies all the time. But they do also get around, get together to mate and lay eggs and stuff. But yeah, from reading the article on the Washington Post, it sounds like it lasted for about 5 minutes, which is honestly a really long time for an aerial insect attack.
In,
Like, I like insects a whole lot, and like that would be a little concerning.
I'm thinking of, can you imagine eating ice cream out there that day?
I mean, has anybody, for anyone who's seen The Birds, like this is that, but with dragonflies.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because if anyone remembers the movie Monsters on the Campus, I love it. Campus Terror. By the way, Campus Terror will start in 2 weeks when students see their tuition bills. But here was the movie, and without giving away the entire plot of 1958, Amanda, as you can see, that is a giant prehistoric dragonfly that this guy actually opened up the window and let in. And of course, as you might expect, all sorts of horrible things then occurred. But we're coming up to your question. I took this picture about 250 million years ago when I started teaching here.
He could retire at any day, folks.
Right, what? My retirement pay is going to be incredible. Compound interest. But I got this close of and back then, what was the size? Now, our biggest one now is about an 8-inch. How big were these?
These were like human wingspan.
Yes,
They
they were
were
hip.
they were they were pretty big.
Right. And if they had swarmed the beach, it would have been entirely
They
different.
would have carried off small children, dogs, anything. They are fairly generalist predators, and they like to hunt on the wing.
Yep. So that's see, watch Monsters on Campus. You'll get an idea of it. But okay, here's my last question for you, and for our viewers. I warned her I was going to pull her into the conversation. Oh, actually, you got one more after this. But okay, Amanda, I know the answer because I was there. You just had to read about it. How come they were so big then and they're not so big now?
Oxygen in the atmosphere.
Very good. Back then it was 35% oxygen. And for those that are not aware of it, we're down to about 21% now. And that's fine for all of us. But why was that important to insects? I mean, why would that change?
Because insects don't have lungs like we do. Like we breathe in air with force and then exhale it with force. Insects rely on the diffusion gradient in the atmosphere to get oxygen inside their body. So you end up with this surface area to volume issue. If you're too big, oxygen can't penetrate the whole way into your body. So they're size limited by the amount of oxygen. I feel like I'm back in grad school.
And you passed your exam because that is correct.
Yes.
In fact, what you'll see nowadays is the larger the insect, and we have some big ones in the tropic, the slower they move because that oxygen has to diffuse it. Essentially, you would be breathing by having holes, which we call spiracles, along the side of your body, more concentrated where you are moving, for example, where wings and your legs are on the thoracic segment there. But that's it. It's coming in and out. You are not able to really adjust this. So they could be large with that much oxygen. And the two other factors, oxygen at very high concentration becomes a poison. And so larger size allows you to dilute it. And the other one, because there's always more than one, the one reason that they shrank afterwards is not only did our oxygen levels start to drop, though that did take a while, is when our first prehistoric birds showed up, these were apparently tasty. And they kind of timed it with that. So very good, very good. All right. Well, for all our viewers, I want to do a couple slides on this plant. The next slide will be yours, Amanda. And this is the cockspur hawthorn. Now, look at this picture. That is a drop dead gorgeous tree in mid-May. Okay, it blooms at that time period, so our flowers are long since gone. And this used to be on everybody's list of trees to plant, but it is now on just about everybody's naughty list. And so when you see these, they're just not the ideal ornamental that people first thought they would be, despite the fact in May they can be incredibly attractive. But here you go, Amanda, your last question. I promise you that. This is again back in May, early June, when it was in bloom. It's not the best picture, but what's that in that circle? Can you
It
tell?
looks like a honeybee.
Nope.
Not a
Come
honeybee?
on. All right. Now, for all our viewers,
It's very
if you
fuzzy.
actually stood next to this plant and just, since you can breathe in and out, took all the air out of your lungs and just went and held it, you would choke because the flowers reek. They smell like dead stuff. So does that help you, Amanda?
Is it a fly?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
All right. Yep.
you sure?
I am positive. Believe me.
Okay. I mean,
Yeah,
granted, you got the action shot image, so like this
yep.
is
But this is one of the hoverflies. So
okay.
can you explain? And yes, I did know it was that, but you know, as you well know, they do look a lot like bees, and
Hmm.
so they frighten people. But explain that fly.
So a lot of flowers that smell like decaying stuff attract flies are more attracted to that for sort of whatever evolutionary reason. But they rely on flies more for pollination versus bees and wasps. So like things like the corpse flower, which is sort of like the largest and most charismatic and doesn't occur in the wild in the United States, flower that smells like death. Flies are the main pollinator of that flower.
Very good. So you're done with your quiz tonight. But
Cool.
but a reminder to all our viewers here is that if you're out there and you're thinking about buying a flowering plant that the flies are attracted to, that's not a good thing. And by the way, we do have some of these flies out in the hills. I mean, of various flies out there. Well, there are a couple of flies that won't bite you, but they kind of hang around you because you smell like dead stuff. Showering is a real plus for that. So anyway, why am I showing you this plant that essentially reeks but looks nice? Because of, here's the other problem. We're seeing it now. You almost might call it an ornamental. Quite honestly, this entire tree was covered this last week in these fruiting structures from cedar quince rust. And every fruit had these little horns coming out of it. The leaves are beginning to drop on it. Some of the trees have already lost all their leaves. And this was a disease that they didn't anticipate when the cultivar really popped up. And it didn't really have it in the beginning, but now it is just covered with these. So the odor they were aware of, but it was a little bit more potent than they expected. And so this cockspur hawthorn, why the leaves can be very attractive if they're not infected. Um, Generally, the leaves start dropping by now, and the fruit is going to be covered with this. And Maddi can probably talk about this a little bit later, but we saw just a lot more leaf diseases and fruit diseases than we normally did with our ornamental trees. And the reason for that was we did have a mild, wet spring and early summer, if you remember back to that. It was rather cool, not cold, but rather cool, 60s. And leaf surfaces stayed wet for an incredibly long time. And that's really the mix for a lot of our diseases, such as apple scab and such. I'm still getting pictures and calls. How come all the leaves are falling off my tree? And typically they're asking me about an apple tree or a small fruiting tree. And the real reason is a lot of the leaf diseases. And at this point in time, and this is an important point to make, this point in time, nothing's going to bring those leaves back. We do our sprays in the spring because those are the most important. Starting to spray now, why that might reduce a little bit of secondary infection, really isn't necessary. And I point that out because I have had numerous calls from people in the last week about tree companies knocking on their door, or that saying, hey, you need to spray your tree or it's going to die. And you don't need to. Having your tree sprayed at this time of year for these leaf diseases that have already run their course is not really necessary. Hopefully, if it's dry next year, we will not see it. My suggestion would be do a good mowing in the fall to break down the leaves so that they crumble away and do not release spores the following spring. But quite frankly, even if you did everything right, your neighbors probably aren't, and spores do not respect property boundaries. So the little bit you do will probably have very little influence on the disease pressure next year. It's essentially how wet it is and whether or not you sprayed at the proper time. Well, another one I'm getting this year, because it has been incredibly wet for much of April, May, and June. July was dry, but you remember those rains we got last week? Brookings saw very 7 inches. And we already had some wet soils, and that essentially made things into pools. Well, this is a picture of a Colorado blue spruce that was planted in a low area last year. Now think of that, low area last year, and it's been almost continually wet up in the Northeast, South Dakota, where this tree is growing, Day County. And so I get the call, and I actually walk out there, and you're going down to a little trough, and these trees are in there. They're going, what's wrong with my tree? What can I spray? Will fertilizer help? And what it is this is poorly drained soils. The plant is literally drowning, and it doesn't need to be sprayed, and fertilizer is not going to help it at all. And you might say, well, John, how do you figure that out? Now, again, there's no signs for this. You're looking at the pattern, but I will tell you that when you get the sort of discoloration to Colorado blue spruce needles, that usually relates to a problem with the root system. And our most common problem with root systems on spruces, they're very shallow, do not do well in poorly drained soils. They do need to have a well-drained soil. They do a little bit better on more porous ones. Yes, indeed, our Black Hill spruce is found along water courses in the Black Hills naturally. Blue spruce, not as much in its native environment. So it is not, excuse me, it is not as tolerant as wet conditions as, excuse me, as our Black Hill spruce. Now, the other thing I should not see on a tree this small is cones. Cone and the same plant. Cones are a good indicator that that plant is stressed. Cones at that age is not a sign of health. It is a sign as the plant is going out. So again, purpling needles, cone production, poorly drained soils, and with this year, with all those rains we had, if the soils were poorly drained to begin with, they were really poorly drained this year. And then finally, this. Look at that hole in the bottom of the apple. I've been getting these now. And you look at that hole, and sometimes there's this little powder around it, what we call frass. And this is one I cut open and look at it. Now, the easiest way to enter an apple is through the base. They don't always have to do that, but they burl in, leaving all this blackened sawdust material called frass. And if you take a look where it's gone, it went right to the center. And the other thing you should notice is the seeds are gone. This is codling moth, and the larvae eat the seeds. They're able to break down that toxin, so they have a food source to themselves. And we're having a second generation right now, and there it is. Codling moth larvae, got little legs to it, thoracic legs there, and it is going through and chewing its way through the apples. Generally, it's the first generation that causes all the problems, but in some years, particularly cool ones, we're a little behind in everything. The second generation is causing problems as well. Quite often, we're able to say your codling moth sprays are done in spring after flowering is done, and you do several sprays then to kill mom who's laying the eggs, and you're done. But this year with that second generation, you need to be spraying, frankly, almost all summer into now. So there's not much you're going to be able to do at this point. And I think I've used up my time there. and we can always come back. So I will stop with that for right now, and we move on to our second, and I will be here for at the end if we have any questions, anything I presented, or if you want to know a little bit more about what life was like 250 million years ago.
Yep. So far, you're off the hook on questions. I don't see any that have come in yet, but we will move on to Maddi and plant diseases. And if folks have questions, don't forget to type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end of the show. But I'll turn it over to you, Maddi.
All right, sounds great. All right, everyone. I am going to be talking just a little bit today about some different diseases and just kind of what we're seeing and what we think we might see kind of for the next month or so. I'll start out. We got a couple of questions through the garden hotline to the clinic about some different diseases on some squash and cucumbers. This is an example of one of the ones that came in, and this is angular leaf spot on squash, and it's a bacterial disease. Bacteria thrive in cool, wet years. And so we've seen a lot of bacteria this year in row crops and vegetable crops, and pretty much every type of plant has had some sort of bacteria problem. So this is one of the examples. Unfortunately, with bacterial diseases, there's not a lot that you can do, but it is kind of important to know what you're dealing with so that you know proper management. Sometimes the bacteria could overwinter on the leaf debris, so it's good to remove leaves that you suspect were infected out of your garden area so that you don't introduce this disease into your garden again. And as John mentioned, we have seen rust all over the place this year. This is an example of it on corn and sunflowers. You can kind of see it here on corn. I'm sorry, I didn't realize this picture was a little bit small. It looks like a orange to black brown spot on every plant. We've been seeing it a lot here in Brookings on grass. All of my neighbors and me have orange looking grass because we have so much rust growing on our grass. We've seen it on tons of woody ornamentals, like what John was mentioning. We've seen it on all sorts of different trees, seeing it all over row crops such as corn and sunflower. And we've seen it on flowers, mallow, so some weeds, and we've also seen it on some veggies and fruits. Again, there's not a ton that you can do for rust at this point in time, but it is one of those that if you do think you've seen rust, definitely want to remove that plant material from your garden area, just in case that rust spore is able to overwinter. Most rust cannot overwinter and it blows up from southern states, but you don't want to take that chance. So make sure if you're having any sort of rust issues that you get those figured out and take some management strategies to prevent it from happening next year. So now we're going to talk about a few things that were problems last year that could be problems again this year. Blossom end rot on tomatoes is one that was a problem last year, and I suspect maybe with the rain that we've had in different parts of the state, it could pop up again this year. So blossom end rot is not actually a disease, but it's a physiological disorder. It's caused by a lack of calcium available for the plant to uptake, and usually the plants that are affected the most are tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and squash. So here's some great examples of that blossom end rot, and you can see it starts on the end of the tomato and kind of works its way in. And it does the same thing on peppers. And there are a few management strategies that you can take to help treat or prevent blossom end rot. Again, as I mentioned, watering is a big thing. So water in proper amounts. Too little or too much water can cause some plant damage and prevent nutrient uptake, including calciums. So also, if you've had a lot of rain and your garden area is flooded out, you could also have some plant damage that's preventing that calcium from being utilized. Fertilizers can help prevent blossom end rot. Nitrate fertilizer is better, but make sure you don't over apply those fertilizers because again, that results in plant damage. There are some plants that are more tolerant of calcium levels, and so they're less likely to have blossom end rot. When I talked to Connie Tandy today, who's our diagnostician at the diagnostic clinic, she said that she was getting a few questions about rots on onions. Because they are a root vegetable, they are having a few rot issues due to the moisture and the cooler temps this year. So I'm just going to kind of talk about a few different things that are bacterial or fungal rots. So this is a fungal rot on onions, and it kind of started, at that stem where the stem and the onion root kind of meet. And so it came in there through some damage. And this disease, it starts as a water soaked lesion. So it might just look like there's a little bit of water up underneath the scales of the onion. And it kind of moved its way down and formed mold in the onion itself. And this is not an onion that you would want to eat because that fungus is going to just rot the whole onion. But if you catch it really early, you could potentially cut it out and use that onion quickly. But definitely want to keep an eye out for and know if you've had it. And definitely something that to keep an eye out for if you decide to store your onions. Another one that is a bacterial issue is a soft rot on onions. And you can kind of see that picture there where some of the scales just kind of become watery and they rot in the middle of the onion. There could be, it's not just one bacteria that causes this. It's usually multiple kind of working together to cause that soft rot within the onion. And again, if you pull up your onions and they feel kind of soft or you don't think they're going to dry out right, then we all recommend that you consider not attempting to store those and just try to use them because they could have some of these rots on them. And this is another bacterial rot. And I chose to highlight this one because we're seeing Pantoia, which is a bacteria in a lot of our row crops this year. So it's very possible that it's also in some of our veggie crops. And it does cause a lot of rots in our different bulb and root type plants. So if you are seeing, kind of that watery look or the onions just really, really soft, it's very possible that you have, again, some of these rots kind of happening. If you would like to try to figure out what's causing those, feel free to send those into the diagnostic clinic and we can kind of work with you on trying to get that diagnosed. And then this is another Pantoia. Let's see. Yeah, this is another Pantoia. Again, it can cause some leaf symptoms, but the biggest issue is going to be that previous picture where it's into the actual onion. Another one that we decided we should talk about would be powdery and downy mildews. You've probably heard me talk about these before because they do seem to pop up every year. So again, powdery mildew, if you've not seen it before, it's a fungal pathogen that grows white mycelia on leaf surfaces. It can occur any time of the year, but especially in warm weather with moderate to high humidity. So we've had some, temperatures that are conducive to disease development. All types of plants are affected by powdery mildew. Here's some great examples of powdery mildew, and you can see it's just that white spider webby looking growth that's going across those leaves, or that white powder looking growth that's on this rose blossom here, or whatever. Can't talk. And so anyways, powdery mildew is one of the ones to kind of keep an eye out for. If you do see powdery mildew, make sure that you remove the affected parts of the plant because powdery mildew is one of those that can overwinter and it will show back up. So you want to try to get it out of your garden. Downy mildew, it is sort of like a fungus. It's an oomycete, which we traditionally refer to as a water mold. Downy mildew is caused by, again, kind of a lot of water and moisture or dew that remains on the leaves for a long period of time with high humidity. So again, we kind of had weather that's conducive to that. Most of our vegetable, herbs, and ornamental plants can be affected. And this is a great example of downy mildew. It's the yellow yellow spots that seem to be kind of contained within the different parts of the leaf, and so they kind of look like angular leaf spots. And here's a comparison of powdery and downy. So downy mildew is the black angular looking spots that you can see, whereas powdery is kind of that, white fluffy growth that's just kind of moving across the entire leaf. So we can have both. We don't see downy that frequently here in South Dakota, but it is one to kind of keep an eye out for because it is a little bit harder to manage if you do have it. Kind of talked about this, but as you have probably already figured out, the both of these are going to be encouraged with lots of extra water. So between heavy dews and lots of irrigation, that could bring on these diseases. Making sure that you water where the plants have time to dry, and try to have good aeration through pruning and plant spacing to just kind of help everything dry out. Considering removing symptomatic plants if you have downy mildew, because that will help reduce the chance of that disease spreading. Gray mold, I've kind of talked about that on the onions. It was that very first one that was the gray mold happening within the onion. It does pop up on most of our plants. It's really common on roses. So it does like kind of cooler temperatures and high humidity. So it's one that we could start seeing as we start getting more into the fall. So here's some examples of gray mold on tomatoes and strawberries. I'll just kind of let you look at those, but it's just gray moldy growth on both leaves and and fruits. It's less likely to be seen in field-grown plants, but it can, pop up here and there. It is likely to be found in greenhouses. Having good plant spacing and reducing that leaf wetness will help prevent the fungal spores from germinating. Remove infected fruits and potentially infected plants to help keep it from spreading. Tomato spotted wilt virus. I know we've talked about this several times on here, but it has showed back up this year, and we've seen it a few times, both on the western and eastern side of the state. So it is a viral disease, as the name suggests. This virus is spread through thrip feeding, and that is when that thrip feeds on an infected plant and then goes and feeds on a healthy plant, and it spreads the virus. Tomatoes are what is usually affected. We do see it more commonly on the western side of the state. Here are some great pictures from rotaburros of the disease, both on the leaves and on the fruit. And as the name suggests, it looks like a spot or a ring spot on the fruit and the leaves. There are resistant varieties to this virus. You can attempt to reduce your thrip numbers through an insecticide application. There's no way to prevent all thrips. As most of us joke, thrips just kind of appear out of dust. But you can attempt to manage the numbers of thrips, especially if you're seeing a lot of them in a greenhouse setting. Removing infected plants is the key to managing this disease. If you've seen this fruit that's symptomatic, you've seen these plants that are symptomatic, remove those plants out of the system. Like I said, you can't prevent all your thrips, but you can remove infected plants and prevent the disease from spreading. As you probably picked up, my theme is kind of bacterial diseases. Here's another one that we talked about last year in an article. So bacterial soft rots on tomatoes, we're going to start seeing those a little more as we go into the fall. This was a pretty gross example that I found in a community garden last year. But it's going to be where you're seeing just, black spots and really soft spots on tomato fruits. And it's caused by too much water and usually some sort of damage to the fruit for that bacteria to get in. And then again, a few other bacterial ones. If you see spots or specks on your tomatoes or peppers, it's probably bacteria. And a lot of times, if your tomato has bacterial spot and you catch it really early, you can eat that tomato. We don't recommend canning it because you could carry that bacteria with it, but it is still safe to eat fresh, especially if you just kind of cut off those spots that have that bacterial issue. Yeah, so that's kind of everything I have. Don't forget about us here at the South Dakota Plant Diagnostic Clinic. We are a service-based clinic. Our basic diagnostics for disease starts at $15 a sample. It does increase based off of the different testing that we have to do. So if you suspect you had tomato spotted wilt virus, That's about a $40 test, just so everyone kind of knows. The average time for us to be able to give you a answer to what your disease problem is about 1 week. It's usually faster, but we are getting into the fall where we're going to start having a lot more samples, so we'll be just a little bit slower on that turnaround, but still pretty quick. If you have questions or need to submit a sample, look us up online or contact us at either our email or phone number.
Awesome. Thanks,
And
Maddi.
yeah, that's all I got. Thanks.
There was a question that came in. Can rust also occur on sorghum broomcorn plants?
I would assume yes. I've never seen it before, but if you think you have that, feel free to shoot me an email and I can work with you on it. We love getting different pictures and getting to see how rust looks on different plants.
Okay, good deal. All right, thank you. And if more folks have questions, put them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk about some bugs. As we move into the sort of getting closer to fall, I know it's still probably pretty warm. It's been cooling down sort of here in Pier the past couple of days, which has been a really nice break from all the insane heat. But as we get closer to fall, the days get a little bit shorter, the temperatures are starting to decrease. Insects that are outside and some of our other arthropod friends are going to start moving around, and some of those that move around end up inside. On this first slide here, I've got the millipedes. Every fall, I always get so many questions about millipedes. These are an example of our non-insect arthropods that will move around in the landscape. They need moisture to survive. So once they cross into people's garages or get into basements, usually they dry out pretty quickly and die. I'm going to repeat this a lot, but the best way to manage that is to just sweep them up. It's not something that sort of requires a chemical control. And then I also have our black vine weevils or our root weevils up there. We've been seeing those since July. They're not quite our fall invaders, but they are one of our common miscreants that ends up as an unwanted roommate. So I actually just got one here in Pier last week when I got back from Wyoming. But yeah, so these are going to be a lot of the insects that are coming inside, but they're not insects that we see feeding or reproducing inside. As we get into especially September, the ones that are coming in are just looking for a place to spend the winter. And I've got an image here of a multicolored Asian lady beetle. This is a ladybug. We have native species of ladybugs in the United States. This is one that was introduced. It's still a ladybug. I don't know why people think it's not. But on the thorax, or that white part behind the head, it's upside down, but it makes sort of a little M. And so that's how you can kind of tell the multicolored Asian lady beetles from some of the other species. But they're an example of an insect that comes inside, usually, getting into people's attics, maybe getting in places where you don't notice. Some of the other ones I see a lot of are the Western conifer seed bugs, which I have a photo later. Lady beetles, like I talked about, picture wing flies, and especially here in Pier, I've got the image up of the box elder bugs. They'll start to congregate, especially on southern exposures, so areas that have sort of more sun as the days, day length starts to change. And they'll move indoors as well. I know here in the office, we usually have quite a few that kind of find their way in and then they can't find their way back out. And these are all things that when they're out in the environment, the seed bugs, the box elder bugs, those are feeding on trees, they're feeding on plants. Lady beetles are predators in our environment, so they're out there looking for aphids or other things to eat. And then our picture wing flies actually are sort of in concert with some different kinds of asters. So if you've had a big sunflower year, that sometimes means we're going to have a big picture wing fly year. But all that to say, none of these are insects that are using people as any part of their life cycle. So these are really all things that are coming inside and they're just being a nuisance. They're not causing any sort of, health problems, or, they're not any reason to worry like if you had bed bugs. So I just want, people to realize that you're going to see some insects inside, but it's okay. You don't have to freak out. It's not something that you've got to, manage immediately. And really, the best defense on these guys is physical. So check your screens, as you can see my orange cat Weasley is doing in this picture. Um, if you've got holes in your screens, especially big holes, like that's absolutely where some things are going to get in. Check your door sweeps, basement windows, any like, and some of these insects aren't super big, so they may not need a whole lot of a gap in order to get in, but go around now and start making your list for your, big box store run over the weekend, to start making some of those repairs. Because all of those holes that you can kind of like plug up and deal with, those will help to cut down on the number of insects and other arthropods that can find their way inside. You may want to consider a perimeter treatment, an insecticide application that goes around the outside of the house. These tend to have a longer residual period, so you want to make sure that you're reading those label directions, especially if you have pets or kids or other things that might be coming into contact with that area frequently. But just know that those treatments, they don't stop the insects from getting inside. What they do is that any insect that crosses that chemical threshold is going to pick up product and then die once it gets indoors. So you are still ending up with dead insects inside. It's just a matter of, did they die because it was a millipede and it dried out, or did it die because it walked across a chemically treated surface and eventually, picked up a lethal dose and died inside. So just, making sure folks understand that the perimeter treatment is not going to prevent them from getting indoors. It'll just make sure they are dead on arrival. This one is our Western conifer seed bug. They're a nice sort of like reddish brown, kind of fancy around the edges. They're some of our leaf-footed bugs, so they've got sort of a leafy projection on that hind leg. But when you see any of these insects that I've been talking about inside, things that you can do, pretty much just sweep or vacuum them up. Especially if they've made it inside and died, just sweep them up, toss them in the garbage, toss them back outside. Not a big deal. If you might not notice where they come in. A lot of times things will sneak in either, the basement or the attic. And then you might, find them around a window or something and you're like, how did they get here? So this may be the time of year where you want to go on some more adventures in your house and check for places. And if there's places where you notice dead insects in the spring, that might be first on your list of places to check this fall. But there's not really anything special to get rid of these guys. Some things not to do. I will never understand hedge balls. They're the fruit of the Osage orange tree, I believe. And every year they show up in the produce section of local grocery stores. They're not edible, please don't eat them, but they also don't do anything for pest management. The theory is that it's an all natural way to deter spiders and everything else. But if you think about one, how many of these would you have to put in your basement in order to have I don't know, any sort of repellent effect? But insects crawl over things, crawl around things, they fly over things. It just is not, it's not logical that these little gnarly green balls would actually do anything to repel insects. And honestly, the whole repelling spiders, the spiders are helping you out by, eating some of the things that get inside. So don't spend your money on hedge balls. They're not going to do anything except make you wonder what's in the corner of the basement, in February when you've forgotten about them. Also, don't use insecticide foggers indoors for these insects. These are not things that are causing any sort of health concern. They're not using people as part of their life cycle. Foggers get misused a lot. So it's just a thing that is absolute overkill and not necessary for these kinds of insects that are moving indoors. On warm days during the winter, some of these guys are going to become active. And that's when you'll see them like around windows and stuff, and you get sort of a second chance to maybe vacuum them up before spring. The picture wing flies, like the one pictured here, are some of the main culprits for that, but the lady beetles and the seed bugs will also exhibit that same behavior. And then in the spring, a lot of these critters, they can't figure out where they came in, and so getting back outside is a problem. And they end up dead in windowsills or, attics or other out of the way places. And same deal, just vacuum them up, get rid of them. If you didn't see them come in, that's really your hint that it's probably up in, the attic or a crawl space or someplace that's maybe not super accessible to you. In which case, like, you don't have to worry. Like, these aren't things that are eating your food or trying to eat you. They're really just nuisances. And this is one of the very beefy pill bugs or isopods that I found this summer. It's been a good year for these guys. Much like the millipedes, they also need moisture to survive. So they find their way indoors. A lot of times, if you've got a dehumidifier running, that's going to be enough to dry it out. They'll die, and you can just sweep them up. And then I also wanted to touch briefly on wasps. These are probably the top insect that people notice most in the fall, especially the wasps that are social and nesting above ground. So these are some European paper wasps. They like to hang out behind my shutters every single year. I've lived in that house for 11 years. I've only gotten stung twice, which I think is a pretty good track record. But at this point in the season, these nests are at their maximum size and strength. So they may have been flying under the radar for the whole summer. And I can guarantee I will get calls this month from people who want to know how to kill the wasps. And I'm going to say, wait until it freezes. Let nature do it for you. Because if you go after these wasps now with spray, they are going to come out in force after you. So if you've been able to live with the wasps this long in the season, just wait a couple more months and nature will take care of it for you, and you don't have to risk getting a bunch of stings. These colonies are annual, so just because there's wasps there, this year doesn't mean they'll come back in that same location next year. But if it is something like shutters, or you notice that there's a hole in your soffit or whatever, odds are decent that like another queen is going to be like, oh, this seems like a good place to set up shop, and we'll reuse that habitat. But it's not like honeybees where it's like the same queen from year to year. So with wasps, it's, constant vigilance in the spring, so you can manage those colonies when they're small, because yeah, by the time we get into August and September, it's safer to just wait it out. And then a final plug for some of our upcoming events. I'll be at the State Fair on Thursday, the 29th, but the Hort Building will be there the whole time. You can stop and pick up resources and ask questions of Master Gardeners. And then Insect Fest will be September 7th at McCrory Gardens. And if you're in the Sioux Falls area this weekend, Bugapalooza is on Saturday, August 10th. At the Butterfly House. I won't be there, but the volunteer naturalists will be, and there will be some other booths as well. So if you're in the Sioux Falls area, you can go check out Bugapalooza this weekend. But that's what I've got. Looks like we've been kind of quiet on the Q&A, so folks might be, John and Maddi might be off the hook for additional questions, but we do have a few minutes, so if there's anything that anyone wants to add, or any last minute questions that you want to try to throw in there, I will keep an eye out for them.
Well, I'll chime in about the Osage orange, the
Okay.
hedge apples. First of all, they are very effective spider killers. You hit a spider with one of those things, you'll flat out kill it. They do work. But correct. Beyond that, and they sell them here. If you live in Mitchell, they're actually found in some of the alleyways. I had a call one time, someone walking their dog and finding these little brains scattered all over the place. And that's Osage orange fruit. Nothing eats the fruit. What ate the fruit died thousands and thousands of years ago. one of the mega fauna that wandered the plains of North America. Probably died out because the fruit tastes crappy, but nevertheless, it produces fruit and nothing really eats it. It's very there's a lot of latex in it. It'd plug you up if you did eat it. We used to, okay, probably a myth more than reality. In the fall, we'd slice them open and they're sticky as could be and toss them in the combines to kill mice. And I don't know if they worked. I was a kid. But it seemed to do the job, but maybe it was the barn cats too. Who knows? We'll give them credit as well. I got a kick out of your picture, physical controls, and there's a cat in the picture. Like, okay, the cat will take care of these
I mean,
unwanted guests.
yeah, when I got my cat Mabel, she came from the streets and there was not a spider alive in the basement after she went through there. They
Oh
had to
yeah.
recolonize when she realized that she was getting 3 meals a day. Then the population bounced back, but she put a real hurt on the arthropod population.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, it's even though I'm not a cat fancier, they do have their function. And I will admit, when we got our barn up and that and did not have a cat. By the way, if you live in the country, you never need to buy a cat. People will drop them off. But yeah, they did a real good job as mousers. So I don't think you can have a barn with any storage and not have a cat to it. Um, at this time of year, though, we really don't see a lot of new pest problems. As you notice, everyone, we're not sitting here saying, go out this week and spray X or Y for management of a pest. There are some that we can do, but at this time of year, we quite often switch gears and are now telling you what to do next year. And in some cases, it just depends on the weather. For those you in the southeast, you remember last year was so dry, we had very few leaf diseases just because we didn't have the moisture in the spring to really allow for those spores to germinate and just infect everything. So, unfortunately, sometimes you are spraying just because Laura Edwards told you that it was going to be a wet spring and you believed her. And I mean, she's right. But that's really what it takes. Is our treatments really for many of our problems were months ago rather than coming up. I should mention one though that we are still spraying for. I didn't put a picture in it, and that's apple maggot. Apple maggots, you probably got another couple of weeks of treatments, usually about every 2 weeks, because apple maggot is one that we typically start spraying for about the 4th of July. Because it does not come out until we actually got some sizable apples that they can attack. And they're still out there. So make sure you're treating those. Oh, and the other pest I should mention is spotted wing Drosophila. I have been getting a couple of samples of that in, and as Amanda probably knows, that's one of our more difficult insects to manage just because of the fact that they go for fully ripe fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And that means the day you're picking it is the day they're going to sting it. And I have seen it where people have gone out and harvested strawberries, late season strawberries, raspberries, taken them home, put them in the refrigerator, and the next day it's just a pile of goo. But I will have to say I have not had a lot of calls the last couple of years, but this year I'm getting them again. So I don't know if that's related to the weather or what, but some things seem to come and go.
Yeah, I wonder if there's maybe, I mean, additional moisture, so they're maybe having an easier time of it too. We've had some dry years. But yeah, and spotted wing Drosophila too, since the eggs and the larva are inside the fruit, like it's a protected life stage, so you can't hit it with any sort of chemical in the field, and anything that you would be spraying it with, the pre-harvest interval, by the time you'd want to harvest it, then it would have rotted anyway. So it's a real doozy. But I know there's been sort of a lot more research on it now, since it's been around for probably closer to 15 years at this point. So especially out of the Pacific Northwest and some of the places where blueberries and raspberries and stuff are really big crops, we're getting some better stuff on sort of a commercial scale for it, but it can still be really tough for a home gardener where you can't necessarily control all of the weed species that are around, like the buckthorn that we talked about last week. Another reason to get rid of buckthorn.
Absolutely. And another thing, I do want to mention this, and we don't have to go right to the time, but another thing I want to mention getting rid of, and that's pesticide containers. Brookings, and I've seen some others where they are having disposal, but the disposal is the pesticide container, not the containers with pesticides in them. And that's a very difficult to do. This is a good reminder, everybody, don't buy something unless you really need it. And the other thing you do need to do is use it up, because one of our real problems is people that take pesticides and they've had it for a year. It's freezed and thawed in their garage and that, so it's not anything effective. But they can't return the pesticide container with pesticide in it on some of those, many of those disposal sites. Apparently, there's one in Pier that can be.
Yeah, the trick is you got to make an appointment and then you have to get the stuff to Pier.
Right.
I think Sioux Falls might be the only municipality that has any sort of household hazardous waste sort of outside of that, but South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources does have unusable pesticide collection. And they do also pesticide container recycling, usually about one date per county in the summer. There might still be a couple dates coming up in August and September. And I know Stephen Robertson posted those on the extension website. But yeah, you got to have that container's got to be triple rinsed. It's got to be dry. You can't have you can't leave any of the rinseate or any of the products still in it. So yeah, only buy what you're going to use. And some people are like, oh, I'm going to get the concentrate. I'm going to be thrifty because then I can make a whole bunch of it. And it's like, if you only need enough for like 1 or 2 applications, just get the mixed stuff already. Like, you don't holding on to the stuff from season to season. You might think you're saving money, but you might not even need it next year. And then depending on how you store it, it might not be in any condition to be functional. So yeah, that's a good point.
All right. But the still problem is you still have to properly dispose of it.
Yes.
And that's a reminder, people. I remember working on this at Michigan State, and it was amazing, actually frightening, how many people their disposal method was pouring down a drain.
Yeah, don't do that.
That's an absolute no-no. So use it, don't buy any more than you need, and use it up, because pesticide containers with pesticide in them are very difficult to dispose of. So I'll
Yep.
finish there, but it's a good reminder.
Yeah. Maddi, any last thoughts on diseases or anything people should keep an eye out for as we move into the fall?
Just know what disease you're dealing with. Don't try to guess it. Even if you don't want to send a sample to the diagnostic clinic, reach out to me or to Connie Tandy, and we can attempt to do some identification over email. It's not as great, but we can try. And definitely don't be making unnecessary applications, because you could be wasting money treating for a fungal disease that's actually a bacterial disease. So always make sure you know what you're trying to deal with.
Yep, that is a great point. And with that, we will head out for this week. We've got 3 more weeks of Garden Hour coming up in August 13th, 20th, and 27th. And then we'll be moving into our off-season every other month schedule. So feel free to email us questions if we didn't get to it online today, but we've got sort of 3 more chances to talk about gardens before the season ends. So thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to our attendees for joining us. We'll see you next week. Happy gardening.